Thunder. A Nature's Fury and Delights novelette, written by Leenie Brown, narrated by Christopher, an authorised voice replica. Chapter 1. As thunder rumbled in the distance, Fitzwilliam Darcy brushed a droplet of rain from his cheek and knew he needed to find shelter soon. Those heavy grey clouds were not going to hold their contents much longer. Indeed, the raindrop he had dashed from his cheek was a sign that a deluge was imminent. He turned his horse toward a small copse of trees beyond which he knew stood a cottage. It was a small structure, one that was seldom used for anything other than an escape to solitude under the guise of hunting. There he would find materials for a fire, blankets, and a few easily kept supplies waiting for him. But most importantly, that cottage would provide for him a refuge from the coming storm. By the time Darcy swung down from his horse and saw to the beast's care, the few drops of rain that had alerted him to danger had increased, and he knew he would do well to enter the cottage without being thoroughly drenched. Pulling his hat down, he ducked his head and raced to the cottage door, where he flung the door wide and entered rapidly, removing his hat from his head and shaking the rain from it as he did. "Oh!" a shocked voice greeted him as he entered. Darcy stopped what he was doing and stared for a moment at the pretty source of the surprised greeting. "Who are you?" he asked as he pushed the door closed. The petite lady before him pulled herself straight, increasing her height by a full half-inch, and lifted her chin. Miss Elizabeth Bennet. As Darcy took a long, silent look at Elizabeth, she shifted under his scrutiny, but just barely. From where he stood, she appeared to be a charming woman in a determined, unwavering sort of fashion. Her eyes were the colour of a clear summer day, her hair tumbled down her back in waves the colour of a strong cup of coffee, and her figure. Ah, her figure. What gentleman would not admire a figure such as hers? Even covered from neck to toe in a sturdy brown pelisse, he could see that it was slight and exceedingly pleasing. "And pray tell, Miss Bennet, how came you to be in my cottage?" The brow over her left eye arched. "How came you to be so wet, sir?" Darcy chuckled at her impertinence. "We call it rain here in the north. What do you call it in the south?" He could tell by her accent that she was not from the area. Her lips twitched. "We call it precipitation when we wish to sound scholarly, or rain when we do not." Clearly she had a sharp wit and a sardonic sense of humour, two traits that Darcy found delightful. His mother had been similar when at home and not in company. "Then you're hiding from the rain as well?" She gave a sharp nod of her head in reply and drew from behind her back a bonnet that looked as if it had been attacked by some angry maid with a broom. "A branch," she said in explanation. "I had hoped to duck in here, repair what I could of my hat and hair, and wait out the storm before continuing my walk." "Are you staying nearby?" Darcy removed his greatcoat and draped it over a chair next to the table, upon which he had placed his hat. "Have you a name?" she replied. "For I should like to know on whose property I am trespassing before I admit to more than my name. I should hate for my host to bear any reproach for my behaviour." To Darcy she did not appear to be anxious regarding her situation in the least. There was no nervous shifting of her feet or faltering in her speech. She spoke boldly as one who had not a worry in the world. In fact, the dancing light in her eyes seemed to say she already knew to whom she was speaking. "And if I refuse to answer?" Darcy motioned to one of the two chairs before the hearth as an invitation for her to be seated, while he went about the task of lighting a fire. "Then I shall tell you no more than my name. As it is, I only need a few moments to repair this hat, and then I will be on my way." She perched on the edge of the chair to the right of the firebox and turned her attention to her bonnet. Darcy sat back on his heels and stared at her incredulously. "You would venture out into that storm if I do not tell you my name? Did you not say you were going to wait out the storm in here?" Her hands stilled, and she lifted puzzled eyes to him. "I entered this cottage unmarried and with a respectable reputation. I intend to leave it in a similar state whether you tell me your name or not." Her eyes and her hands returned to her work. She was intent upon leaving. Did she lack sense? She had seemed intelligent up until now. "You cannot go out into that storm. I cannot allow it." "You cannot allow it?" Her voice was full of indignation. "You are nobody to me save a stranger whose name I do not even know, and I will leave if I choose." She lifted her bonnet, tipped it one way and then another before resuming her repairs. She was being foolish. Between the rain and the lightning mixed with the fog that often settled into this valley, she would be lost in moments after leaving the safety of this cottage. "How well do you know the path?" He struck the flint against the steel over his tinderbox. Perhaps he could talk some sense into her, make her see reason and change her decision. No one would know she was here alone with him. To leave just to protect her reputation when leaving would put her life in danger was utter foolishness. I've walked it every day for the past 6 days. He bent and blew on the glowing tinder, encouraging the fire to leap up and catch the small bit of kindling he held in his hand. And how many of those times were in the rain and fog, he asked, as he put the burning kindling into the firebox. The dampness would be soon driven out of the air in the cottage, once the flames grew strong enough to devour a small log. Then he would boil some water and make tea. There was fog yesterday. She lifted her hat once again for inspection. Seeing her look of satisfaction, Darcy snatched the bonnet from her. "My hat!" Elizabeth exclaimed as she grabbed for it. Darcy placed it behind his back so that she could not reach it. The fog yesterday was light. Today, with this rain, it will be heavy. You will not be able to see more than a few feet in front of you, which will make it far too easy for you to get turned around and find yourself facing a rocky precipice instead of the path to the Foley's home. He smiled as her mouth dropped open. You bear a resemblance to Mrs. Foley when you are displeased. And have you seen my great-aunt displeased very often, Mr. Darcy? She folded her arm and glared at him. He chuckled. Yes, he had seen that glare a few times in his life. More when I was younger and especially when my cousin was visiting, but it has been years. I do not feel the need to eat her apples any longer. He crossed the room and placed Elizabeth's bonnet near his hat on the table. I should hate to see how angry she would be with me if she were to discover I allowed her niece to wander through a storm and fall to her death. He shook his head. The bonnet and you are both remaining. And how angry do you think my aunt will be when she discovers I have spent an extended period of time in a cottage with a gentleman alone? He grabbed her wrist as she attempted to reach around him and retrieve her hat. The action drew her closer to him. Even at her full height, she only came to his chin. Do you still climb trees? Her look of anger faded from her eyes, and the scathing reproof he was certain she was about to unleash on him died on her lips. Do you, he repeated, still climb trees? Her nearness was causing his breath to quicken. He should let go of her wrist, but then she might snatch that bonnet and fly from the cottage. How do you know I used to climb trees? He shrugged, and then lifting her hand turned it over to inspect her palm. You have visited your aunt before, and you like apples. Her hands were not so soft as some young ladies' hands were, but they were not so rough as those of his housekeeper or any of his maids. She must not toil with her hands, she must just thwart propriety. Her pelisse was made of good cloth, which also spoke to her status as higher than that of a tenant farmer's daughter. He peeked at her sheepishly. I believe it was about 3 years ago when I watched someone who very much resembled you climb the apple tree near Mrs. Foley's kitchen. I was returning home from this very cottage. My father was staying here for 2 more days, but my mother wished to have me home for a time before I returned to school. I had intended to stop at your aunt's home and ask for an apple, but then I saw you. Her brows were furrowed. You were going to ask for an apple, not take one? He shook his head. I had learned my lesson about that a few years earlier. My father was even less pleased than your aunt when he heard about it. To be fair, she had warned my cousin and me that she would tell him if she ever caught us again. She is a woman of her word. As am I. Elizabeth pulled her hand from his grip and attempted once again to snatch her hat. Without thinking, Darcy wrapped his arms around her to keep her from reaching the bonnet, but then quickly released her, and taking up her bonnet, stood across the table from her. Forgive me, I was not thinking about anything but your safety. Chapter 2. Darcy's instinct may have been focused on keeping her here, safe, warm, and dry within this cottage when he wrapped his arms around her. But now, as he stood across from her with a table between them, those same instincts were causing him to question his own safety. It was not that she posed some sort of danger to him physically. He certainly did not feel threatened. He did not expect her to snatch up the poker from the fire and attack him with it. Nor did he expect her to throw herself at him and pummel him into unconsciousness. His person, his physical being, was not in danger of injury. However, from the jolt of pleasure he had received when he wrapped his arms around her, he knew that he was in grave danger of being tortured by his desires, and that thought was excessively unsettling. He had been attracted to many ladies in his several seasons in town. He had even, at one time, imagined himself in love with Miss Scott, whose father owned an estate no more than 10 miles from his father's. Therefore it was not as if he'd never experienced the sensations of desire. He had, and yet until this moment, he had never feared those desires as he did now, for he had never felt such an immediate and nearly overwhelming longing as he had in that brief moment when he held Elizabeth in his arms. Perhaps it would be best if they were not to remain here, together and alone in this cottage. He turned her bonnet in his hands. "The rain is too heavy," he muttered. "It would not be safe to leave." But neither was staying here with her. His father was ill. It was likely that Darcy would soon come into his inheritance. He had a sister, a much younger sister, who would need him, and there were tenants and lands and staff who would be relying on him to be focused and able. Just at that moment, nature punctuated his thoughts with a deep grumbling roll of thunder. Whether Elizabeth liked it or not, and whether he found it safe or not to remain here with her, leaving was presently an ill-advised proposition. They would just have to make the best of it, unless... He turned toward the door and considered the option carefully before turning back to her. "I will leave. I will make sure the fire is enough to keep you warm and chase away the damp. We will have a cup of tea and then I shall leave." Her look of shocked displeasure from a moment ago, when he had kept her from recovering her hat, slid into one of confusion. "But this is your cottage, sir. If anyone should leave, it should be me. I am the interloper. There is no need for you to suffer the discomfort of the weather." "No," he said when she took a slight pause. "What sort of gentleman would I be if I allowed a lady to wander out into the storm, facing the ravages of the weather and the perils of an unfamiliar countryside? It is insupportable. You must remain here, and I will shelter with my horse. Then, when the rain has eased, I shall make my way home. I know this country far better than you. Even with a layer of fog as thick as porridge, I will be able to pick my way home unscathed." "But you will catch a chill." "And you would not." She folded her arms, a gesture at which she seemed to be quite proficient. "I would not be sitting in the damp air for who knows how long before beginning my journey," she retorted. He rounded the table and made his way towards her. "No," he said. "You would be soaked through in minutes and wandering the hillside. That would be so much better." He held her bonnet out to her. "This will not even keep one hair dry. If I allow you to leave this cottage, I will be party to your demise, and that is something I refuse to be." She took her bonnet from him and, lifting her chin, said nothing. Instead, she returned to her seat near the fire, placed her hat on her lap, and began repairing her hair. Darcy stalked to the fire and gave it a stir before adding a small log. "If you are thinking of not heeding my words and escaping before the tea is ready, you must know that I will follow you, and then we both will be in danger of catching a chill or worse." She glared at him, and an uneasy silence crept over the room as the fire snapped and crackled its way to life. Darcy rose from nursing the fire and retrieved a kettle of water. It was the same kettle that his father always used upon first arriving at the cottage, and it was the kettle that Darcy would see filled with water before leaving, just as his father had always done and instructed him to do. There was nothing better than finding solitude in front of a fire with a cup of tea. That is what his father had always said and what Darcy had come to know as truth. However, today his solitude would not be as it normally was. Today he would not sit silently before the hearth and watch the flames as he contemplated his future and that of his estate. He stared at the kettle where it hung over the flames, his estate. He glanced at the beguiling and palpably displeased Elizabeth Bennet, who was nearly finished repairing her hair and looking very much as if she was preparing for a journey, and shook his head. She was stubborn. "How often do you visit your aunt?" If he could engage her in some conversation, she might not flee from safety. He had an aunt who was stubborn to a fault and would not hesitate to jump headlong into some untenable situation just because she had determined to do so and could not be moved. Elizabeth seemed more intelligent than that. Therefore, he would attempt to sway her from her resolve. She arched a brow at him, scepticism etched in her features as if she knew his plan. "Not so often as I would like." "And how often would you wish to visit your aunt?" Darcy asked as he settled into a chair next to her. She drew a breath and released it slowly while staring into the fire, as her fingers toyed with the ribbon on her bonnet. The right corner of her mouth tipped up while a soft expression settled into her eyes. "Daily." The word was spoken softly and followed by a small sigh. "But that is not possible." She turned her eyes toward him, and her lips curved into an unsatisfied smile. "Therefore, I shall have to satisfy myself with once every 3 years." Her eyes returned to their observation of the fire. "The distance and cost are too great for it to happen more often." "That is unfortunate." "Indeed, it is." Her shoulders lifted and lowered in a shallow shrug. "However, when one has a mother with a love of shopping and 4 sisters who require care and clothing the same as she does, frequent trips for pleasure with no hope of marriage as the happy result of such an expenditure is simply insupportable." There was a hint of bitterness to her tone. "Do you travel alone?" She shook her head. "My aunt and uncle, as well as my eldest sister, travel with me. Mrs. Foley is my aunt's aunt, though she is more of a mother than an aunt." "Your other sisters and your mother do not travel with you?" Again, Elizabeth shook her head, but this time added a small laugh. "Unless there is a favourable chance of finding either a plethora of shops or single gentlemen, my mother is not inclined to undertake a journey, nor are my 2 younger sisters, although they are far from marriageable age." "And what of your other sister? You did say you had 4 sisters, did you not?" Elizabeth nodded. "So far you have only mentioned 3. "You cipher well," she replied with a teasing smile. Darcy's lips tipped up into a happy expression of their own accord. Teasing was not always something he endured with any significant amount of pleasure. However, when the source of such teasing was as pretty as the lady beside him, and filled with the good humour so evident in her expression, it became not something to be endured, but rather something to be sought and entered into with abandon. "My tutor would be pleased to hear that. I confess learning the facts and figures was not difficult, but it was never so interesting as what might be happening outside the window. Therefore, it took me longer to learn them than it should have, and tried the patience of both my tutor and my father. Fortunately, the reprimands I received were not excessively harsh." The enchanting sparkle of amusement in her eyes caused him to cease speaking. She was captivating, simply captivating. How he would force himself to go sit with his horse instead of here by her side was beyond him. He pushed up from his seat and crossed to the fire to retrieve the kettle and begin preparing the tea. "I must say that such a confession surprises me," Elizabeth said. "You strike me as a very determined and focused sort of individual, not the sort who would stare out windows when work must be done." He glanced at her, but then returned his eyes to watching the water pour from the kettle into the teapot. "I am. Now, most times. However, it is a learned skill, based, I suppose, on a natural inclination. But about your 4th sister, why does she not travel with you?" He smiled at the teapot after a quick glance in her direction had informed him that her hat was no longer on her lap, but resting near the leg of her chair. For now, it seemed, she was content to remain where she was and converse with him, rather than fleeing into the gathering storm. A deep growl of thunder rumbled through the cottage. "The onslaught grows near," he said as he covered the tea and returned to his chair while it steeped. Elizabeth looked up at the ceiling. "It sounds as if it is nearly overhead." Darcy nodded. "I would imagine it nearly is. Your 4th sister, the one who is next in age to you," he prompted. "Mary would be pleased to have been allowed to join Jane and me on our journey. However, Mamma insisted that 2 young ladies for whom to care were enough trouble for her brother and his wife, seeing as there was also their baby to consider, and the fact that my aunt is increasing and quite tired because of it. It mattered not to my mother that 3 sets of helping hands and watching eyes would allow our aunt more rest. The carriage would be more cramped, and according to Mamma, confined spaces, cramped conditions, and a lack of freedom to fidget and move would be excessively unpleasant for one who is in the early stages of increasing." Elizabeth shrugged. "For Mamma that is most likely true, but as Aunt Gardner says, each lady is an individual. However, our mother could not be moved, and our father thought it best to keep Mary at home." She turned towards him, and the twinkling in her eyes caught him by surprise. He would have expected such a recital of facts to be accompanied by a look of exasperation or censure, not amusement. Leaning towards him, she lowered her voice and said, "I suspect Papa insisted on Mary remaining home so that he would have someone capable of sensible conversation to visit with him in his book room." Darcy's brows furrowed. "Your mother and younger sisters are incapable of sensible conversation?" "Sadly, yes." It seemed odd to Darcy that Elizabeth would have such a mother. Most of the mothers and daughters he had met, whether in town or in the country, were very much like each other. Therefore, if a mother was insensible, her daughter was likely to be the same. Yet Elizabeth was far from insensible. Is it because they are truly incapable, or because they choose to be incapable? Darcy asked. Elizabeth's lips turned downward as her eyebrows drew together while she considered his question. I had never contemplated the cause, she said. He had suspected as much from her confused expression. Mamma seems to lack any great ability to be sensible for extended periods of time, and I do not believe it to be an act. Lydia and Kitty are much like Mamma. But being young, might they not be taught? Darcy asked. The look of confusion remained on Elizabeth's face, but her left brow arched. It is entirely possible, I suppose. Chapter 3. Darcy rose to fetch the tea. I eventually learned my figures and how to focus on the task at hand rather than the view outside the window. It is, in my opinion, absolutely possible for a young man or lady to learn how to alter their natural tendencies if there is an aptitude for learning. Neither of my younger sisters is without the ability to learn. Having the desire to learn is something completely different. The teapot chattered against the rim of the cup. Elizabeth was standing at his side, and her presence was causing him some unease. It was not an unpleasant unease. It was once again his desires which plagued him. How the lady's mere presence at his side could cause such a reaction befuddled him. He usually held himself in good regulation without much effort, but not today, not here, not with her. I fear I have no cream or sugar to offer. He lifted the cup and saucer from the counter, turned toward her, and extended them in invitation. I'm sure I shan't miss them. As she took the tea from him, her hand grazed his in the lightest, smallest touch. While it might have only been a fleeting glance of contact between them, it was enough for him to need to wait until she had returned to her seat before he thought himself capable of lifting his own tea without sloshing it over the rim. Good heavens, she was unsettling. No matter how much he desired to linger over this cup of tea while conversing with her, he knew that he needed to make his escape soon while he still held some resolve to do so. As if the weather was attempting to mirror his state of mind, the shutters rattled as the wind grew in its intensity, a clap of thunder driving it forward. Darcy lifted his cup and took a sip of its contents before saying, I am very glad to not be out in it. Elizabeth smiled at him sheepishly. As am I. She placed her tea and saucer on the table that stood between them. I find I must thank you for your insistence that I remain, and I feel almost as if I should apologize for causing you to have to behave in such a high-handed fashion in order to see me safe. Her smile turned impertinent, and with shaking hands, Darcy relinquished his tea to the table, but not without first spilling a portion of it on his waistcoat. Blast, he muttered, brushing at the wetness with the palm of his hand. I assure you I am usually not so clumsy. It was her infernal ability to rattle him with the slightest enchanting expression that had a most disconcerting effect on him. He glanced up at her. Her lips were concealed behind her hand, but he could tell from her eyes that she was thoroughly amused by his predicament. At least, he consoled himself, she seemed unaware that she was the cause of his lack of grace. If you remove it and hang it in front of the hearth, the heat from the fire will have it dried much more quickly than your hand will. The comment was followed by a small laugh. A small, charming laugh that she was unable to catch and that caused him to smile. Forgive me, she continued. I had not meant to startle you with my confession. She covered her lips with her fingers while her eyes continued to dance with merriment. Darcy began to unbutton his waistcoat. You will not be shocked and appalled if I'm missing an article of clothing from my ensemble. His lips twitched. Her good humour was contagious. She leaned back in her chair, picked up her cup and replied, I shall be perfectly at ease. And she did look it, sitting in such a relaxed fashion and smiling behind her cup as she sipped her tea. How he would love to see her sitting just so and teasing him every day. He turned away from her while he shrugged out of his coat and began removing his waistcoat as he argued against his attraction to her. She was young, perhaps too young for him to be considering in such a fashion. He shook his head slightly. His father was not long for this earth, and Pemberley was a large estate. While Elizabeth appeared to be the age of many who married during their first season, and she possessed the intelligence, and even likely some of the training necessary, to run an estate, he was uncertain if asking her to consider taking on the monumental task of the care of him and his home, just so he could have his desires assuaged, was something about which he should even be thinking. He placed a chair with a straight ladder back in front of the fire and draped his waistcoat over it. As he was turning to make some comment to Elizabeth about it drying quickly, the door opened and a person he knew well stepped into the cottage. "What brings you here?" Darcy asked. Of all the people to arrive unannounced anywhere, George Wickham was the least welcome in Darcy's opinion. The conniving scoundrel was often the source of one scandal or another, although he was ordinarily sly enough for his name not to be associated with said scandal. On the odd occasion when Wickham's name did become attached to a scandal, Darcy was the one left scrambling to repair whatever damage had been done, because Darcy loved his father, and his father doted on his godson. So, while Darcy disapproved of Wickham's actions in the most robust sense of the word, he felt compelled to hide Wickham's dissipation from his father, as Darcy would not be the source of heartache for a parent he loved so well. "What? No word of greeting?" Wickham taunted as he shook rain from his hat. Wickham's flippant, sneering attitude always drove Darcy to distraction. It was as if the man was unable to consider life seriously or to realise that by behaving as he did, throwing money away on cards, chasing every pretty girl he met and dallying with those with fewer scruples or weaker minds, had any long-lasting consequences. Darcy continued to hold out hope that eventually, as he aged, Wickham would mature and take hold of the good principles which Darcy knew both his own father and Wickham's father had attempted to instill within George. However, with each passing season that hope increasingly faded as Wickham appeared to grow more and more set in his dissipated ways. "Well, isn't this a cosy scene?" As he removed his greatcoat, Wickham's eyes had come to rest on Elizabeth. "I dare say if your father knew you had such handsome company, he'd not have sent me to ensure you are well." Wickham's eyes raked Elizabeth's form and Darcy stepped between them. "Miss Bennet is simply taking shelter until the rain has passed." Darcy attempted to keep his tone calm and flat. However, the way Wickham's lips curled into a mocking smile made it nearly impossible, and he was certain a small bit of his anger at Wickham's implication that Miss Bennet was anything but virtuous slipped into his words. "And that is why you are disrobing?" Wickham laughed. Darcy snatched up his jacket from his chair and began putting it on. "I spilled tea on my waistcoat. I simply removed it and placed it in front of the fire so it could dry." He tipped his head toward the kitchen. "There is still tea in the pot if you would like a cup, and room before the fire for your things to dry." Wickham nodded his acceptance, but before moving to place his things before the fire or retrieve a cup of tea, he bowed and extended his pleasure in meeting Elizabeth. "How came you to be in need of shelter?" he asked as he draped his coat across the second straight-back chair Darcy had brought from the table to the hearth. "I was walking, and when the sky grew dark, and since a tree dared to try to snatch my bonnet from my head, I thought to seek shelter. Fortunately, I remembered seeing this cottage on a previous walk and was able to find it before the rain began." The way Elizabeth had pulled herself straight and held her cup primly did not go unnoticed by Darcy. There was a wariness about her now that even when he'd startled her by his arrival had not existed. Was it his terse greeting of Wickham or Wickham's vulgar implication of what was happening between her and Darcy that caused it? Or did she innately suspect that the man was not to be trusted? Darcy would have loved to have asked her, but unfortunately that was not possible. So, for now, he would remain curious and be glad that no matter the reason she did not seem at ease with Wickham. "You are fortunate," Wickham said, as he brought his tea from the kitchen to where they sat near the hearth. The room was one of considerable size, featuring a small kitchen in one corner and a table at the other end, and to the right of the door, with a large hearth between the kitchen and table. "I would indeed say I am," Elizabeth replied. "I was able to find this place before one drop of rain fell," Wickham chuckled. "Well, that is fortunate indeed. It is not what I meant." Elizabeth's brow furrowed. "It is not?" Wickham shook his head and looked at Darcy. "My friend is not known for welcoming strangers. I'm truly shocked he allowed you entrance." "I have found Mr. Darcy to be nothing but welcoming, a trifle high-handed in compelling me to stay, but in all, a perfect gentleman. Are you certain you have known him long?" Elizabeth asked. Darcy, who wanted to leap into the conversation and defend himself, remained silent. He'd seen the way Elizabeth's left brow had arched when Wickham described him as "my friend." He was confident that such a look, coupled with her wariness, indicated that she did not believe Wickham and was about to discover the truth. In his mind, it would be far better for her to discover Wickham's less charming side on her own than through his own defence of himself. "I have known him all my life." Wickham relaxed back into his chair and casually crossed his ankles in front of him. He was perfectly at ease, just as he always seemed to be. There was not much which seemed to ruffle Wickham's charming feathers. It was this carefree manner which Darcy had seen Wickham use to win over people, both young and old, servant and superior. Worldly wise and innocently naive, it was perhaps his most dangerous ability, for with this ease he seemed able to convince many that he was all he pretended to be. However, Darcy had seen behind the facade because Wickham had one major weakness: jealousy. He wanted what Darcy had, and he did not seem to care if Darcy knew it. My father and Darcy's father are friends from childhood. While Darcy's father was born to wealth and position, my own father was not. He is but a solicitor who has become a part of his friend's staff. How lovely, Elizabeth inserted before Wickham could continue. Lovely? As that unrestrained question flew from Wickham's mouth, Darcy saw Wickham's composure falter for the briefest of moments. Oh, indeed, Elizabeth exclaimed. To be so connected to a lifelong friend must be simply wonderful. My Uncle Phillips is a solicitor, and he finds great pleasure in being able to provide his friends with the service they need. I do not believe he would be happy doing anything else. It is as if he were born to the position, which he was not. He fell into it rather by chance. As she spoke, Elizabeth tilted her head and studied Wickham. My uncle hopes one day to pass on his business to his son, just as my grandfather passed it on to him. Will you be following your father's footsteps? Chapter 4. Darcy fought to contain his amusement at Wickham's apparent inability to formulate a quick response. More than her beauty, Elizabeth's keen mind and this particular ability to leave a man speechless, who was known for possessing a silver tongue, recommended her to Darcy as the best possible choice for his future wife. When the storm passed, he would see her home and then invite her to visit him and Pemberley, so that she could meet both his father and his sister. Feeling the happiness that such thoughts brought him, he entered the conversation. Our fathers would prefer for him to take orders, since there is a valuable living within my father's power to bestow. A member of the clergy? Elizabeth looked genuinely shocked at the suggestion, which caused Darcy's lips to twitch with barely contained amusement. It is a respectable and worthwhile profession, she continued, and I know I have only just met you, Mr. Wickham, and am being entirely too forward by half, but I must say I question the wisdom in such a thing. How so? Darcy attempted to make the question sound excessively serious, while within he was delighted to hear Elizabeth suggest that Wickham would not make a good man of the cloth. Yes, yes, Wickham said, finally finding his tongue. I should also like to know your reasoning, as I think I should be good at giving sermons. But would you enjoy it? Elizabeth asked. I do not see why I would not. The living is substantial and the duties are not excessive. In fact, the living includes a rector who would provide me with all the assistance I should need, so that the office would never become burdensome. Darcy watched Elizabeth pull her bottom lip between her teeth, furrow her brow, relax it, arch her left eyebrow, and tip her head. Eagerly, he waited to hear her thoughts. I do not doubt, sir, Elizabeth began after a moment of silent contemplation, that you possess the ability to deliver a sermon in a most enjoyable fashion. You appear to me to be always at ease, and I would venture a guess that you are a natural conversation partner, with the ability to discuss a wide range of topics with relatively little effort. The accuracy of Elizabeth's musing astounded Darcy. Such a talent, she continued, lends itself well to becoming a parson or a solicitor. However, she paused, and Darcy imagined, from the way her eyes narrowed slightly and her lips pursed, that she was selecting her next words carefully. Only moments ago, you admitted that you and Mr. Darcy have known each other all your life, yet you seem to not truly understand who he is. Added to that, you made accusations about me without ever having met me. While a solicitor might find such flaws in character to be of little hindrance in his work, the same cannot be said for a parson. The man tasked with the responsibility to care for his parish and its needs would find such an inability to understand the people around and closest to him, as well as the propensity to assume the worst without gathering the facts, to be a great detriment to completing his duties with any great degree of effectiveness. Rising, Darcy gathered both his and Elizabeth's empty cup. He needed to have something to do with his hands rather than applauding Elizabeth's speech, which appeared to have had a very unsettling effect on Wickham. Darcy crossed to the kitchen and placed the dishes on the workbench just as Wickham began to respond. "That is a very pretty speech." His voice carried less of his usual charm than it had moments ago. Yes, thought Darcy, Wickham was most decidedly affronted. "In fact," Wickham continued, "I dare say it is nearly pretty enough to capture Darcy's attention and potentially his fortune." Wickham relaxed further into his chair, placed his cup beside him on the table, and propping his elbows on the arms of his chair, steepled his fingers. The ladies in town should try such a tactic, for none of them have yet succeeded in snaring the great Fitzwilliam Darcy, although many have tried. One shoulder lifted and lowered in a half-shrug. But then, none, not even you, have a hope of claiming his fortune other than the gifts he might bestow on her for certain favours, for he has already promised to another. Tell me, Miss Elizabeth, will you be satisfied to simply be his mistress instead of the mistress of Pemberley? For if not, I would suggest you save your fanciful reasonings to impress some other wealthy chap. Neither the rattling of the shutters by the howling wind nor the rumbling of distant thunder could compare to the fury that flashed in Elizabeth's eyes. Darcy, who had moved toward Wickham ready to do the man harm, stopped dead in his tracks. There was no way he was going to stand between Wickham and what he justly deserved. Darcy would wait his turn and thrash whatever pieces remained when Elizabeth was through. Elizabeth's hands smoothed the fabric of her dress over her knees as her shoulders rose and fell in time with several deliberate breaths. Then she folded her hands, lifted her chin, and began to speak. "Mr. Wickham, were this my house, I would gladly have you removed no matter how the storm raged outside. Happily for you, this is not my house. However, I should wonder if Mr. Darcy does not see you on your way soon, for you have not only maligned him, but you have also spoken ill of his guest." Her hands once again smoothed her skirt as she attempted to calm herself. Darcy could see the battle for regulation play out in the set of her jaw, and the twitch of her lips as well as in the narrowing of her enchanting eyes. "I cannot give a moment's credence to any of the shade you attempt to throw on your friend. For you see, my great-aunt has only ever spoken highly of both Mr. Darcy and his father. She is no swift judge of character. Her opinions are based on long and thorough consideration. She would never be so bold as you and throw disparagement on the character of someone she had only just met as you have done to me. I will assure you, Mr. Wickham, that my character is not as you have supposed. I am and always have been circumspect in my behaviour. I do not give favours to any gentleman regardless of whether or not he offers gifts, and I assure you that my virtue is intact and will remain so until the day I decide to marry and stand before the vicar to take my vows." She rose from her chair and moved to stand behind it. Her fingertips pressed into the cushion on the back as she grasped it firmly. "I had no intention of attempting to sway Mr. Darcy toward marriage with either my words or actions when I entered this cottage, nor do I have any now. Indeed, I was set to leave this cottage as soon as Mr. Darcy entered, so that such a thing would not happen. What am I to him? A stranger, the niece of a tenant, naught else. It was his kind heart which compelled me to stay when I would have left." She laughed a small bitter laugh and shook her head. "It was that same kindness that offered you a cup of tea and a place at the fire, after you entered and spoke so meanly of both him and me, and it is that kindness that keeps him now from hurling you out into the storm so that I might have my say." Darcy nodded and returned the small smile she gave him. "How you cannot know Mr. Darcy's character after so many years of acquaintance leaves me to wonder if you're either stupid or—" her lips pursed and her eyes sparkled, "merely jealous." She shrugged. "And why would you not be? Mr. Darcy is twice the man you could ever hope to be. He is far more handsome. His manners are perfectly refined. And shall we not overlook the obvious? He has a fortune." She released her grip on the back of the chair. "But his greatest wealth is not found in his riches, Mr. Wickham. It is found in his noble and honourable character, and those are not things to which one must be born." She smiled at Darcy again. "I should be honoured to count him as a friend, and I will add that whoever this lady is to whom he is betrothed is a very fortunate lady indeed, for she will find herself well cared for and respected." She shifted her eyes back to Wickham. "Again, those are riches that any man can offer a lady. There is no need to be born to such." "I am not betrothed," Darcy said. "You are not?" Elizabeth asked in feigned surprise, causing Darcy to grin. "Do you mean to tell me that none of what Mr. Wickham has said is true?" "Not a word," Darcy replied. Then he tipped his head. "No, I am incorrect. He is the son of my father's friend and solicitor. That much is true. He held up a finger. And I am not always welcoming to strangers. I find it trying to meet new people. Well, that is a fault to be sure, Elizabeth replied lightly. But then some of us new people can be rather trying. Darcy chuckled and then turned to Wickham. I believe Miss Elizabeth is correct. It is time that you left. Your disparagement of myself, while I do not condone it, I can bear. However, I cannot and will not forbear such treatment of any guest in my home, most especially not of Miss Elizabeth. The thunder grows distant. The worst is over. Please inform my father that I will return after I have seen Miss Elizabeth safely return to her aunt. Wickham sneered, but rose from his chair. And what do you think he will say when I tell him how I found you? Indeed, what will everyone say when they hear the tale I have to tell? He looked past Darcy to Elizabeth. You did not think you could lecture me as you did without paying some price now, did you? If they believe you, then they are greater fools than you, Elizabeth returned. Fools they may be, but ruined you will be, Wickham retorted. And with those words, Darcy found the end of his patience while his fist found Wickham's jaw. Wickham yelped in pain, his right hand flying to rub his jaw as he scooted away from Darcy. You will say nothing to besmirch Miss Elizabeth, Darcy growled, or I will call you out. And what of your father? He'll be greatly displeased with you for it. I am his favourite. Get out, Darcy shouted. I will no longer hide your indiscretions from him. See how long his preference lasts when he learns of all you have done. One word, Wickham spat back, and I will tell how you are here with her. His chin jutted in the direction of Elizabeth. Out! Darcy moved to extract the scoundrel bodily if necessary. But being the coward Wickham was, he quickly snatched his things and reached the door before Darcy had the pleasure of laying a hand on him. As the loud rattling of an angrily closed door rang through the cottage, Darcy threw the latch and turned towards Elizabeth. He will not be allowed entrance, Darcy assured her, and I will not be leaving until we leave together. I have not one morsel of trust in him. I have seen and heard about far too much reprehensible behaviour where he is concerned. Darcy moved quickly across the room as he spoke to where Elizabeth stood with her arms wrapped around herself. Are you well? Elizabeth nodded and gave him a wavering smile. I am until he tells his tale. Then I am ruined, and my whole family tainted. She shook her head as she looked toward the ceiling. I should never have stayed. Darcy placed a hand on each of her upper arms and drew her close. You stayed because you are wise, he said as he wrapped her in his embrace. She was trembling, so he rubbed her back reassuringly. You will not suffer because of him. She pushed away from him, but only just. She did not move so far that his arms could not still encircle her. How can I not? You said yourself that he is not to be trusted. He's angry with me. He dislikes you, and therefore he has no reason not to whisper about this into the ear of anyone willing to listen. My aunt, she paused, and pressed her lips together to keep them from trembling, and my sister. They will be so disappointed. A tear slid down her cheek. We shall tell the tale before he does, and I doubt he realises who your aunt is. He brushed the tear from her cheek. I dare say there is not a soul in all of Derbyshire who would dare to believe one ill word about her great niece. He smiled down at her. Mrs. Foley is well respected, as is her brother, and there are very few who would dare to speak against the Vicar of Kympton. Are you certain? Darcy nodded and released her from his embrace. I am. Did you mean what you said about the lady who marries me being fortunate? Her brow furrowed as her lashes fluttered over confused eyes. I did. Then, Darcy paused to wipe his suddenly moist hands on his breeches. He swallowed and willed his heart not to race so fast that it would explode. Would you consider being that lady? Her mouth dropped open as shock suffused her face. She shook her head. We have only just met. We are little more than strangers. I was not being anything less than honest when I said I did not intend to persuade you into marrying me. I know I am a gentleman's daughter, and you are a gentleman's son, and as such we are not unequal. However, Longbourn could be contained within Pemberley many times over. The spheres in which we move are so very different. I do not ask you to gain position or wealth. He moved a fraction of an inch closer to her. It was not that there was a significant gap between where he stood and where she was, but her words made him feel as if a great chasm was about to appear in front of them, dashing all the fledgling hope that had formed in his heart since finding her here in his cottage. I do not even ask because I fear any scandal will arise from our sojourn here. I ask because my heart demands it." He shook his head and shrugged. "I do not understand this need. I only know that I feel as if I've found a dear friend whom I shall grieve most severely if she's not at my side." He smiled and laughed lightly. "Your aunt's brother has always said, 'Do not seek a wife. Seek a companion for your future life.' I never understood him until now." He shrugged. "I always thought he was attempting to make the selection of the mistress for my estate and the mother of its heir into something of a pious platitude. But he was not. I see that now in your eyes. I hear it in your words, and I feel it in your presence." "We are little more than strangers," Elizabeth repeated. "Allow me to borrow a story from the vicar's arsenal and ask you how long Isaac knew Rebecca before he loved her." "That is not the same," she said, shaking her head. "Our society is not their society." "But cannot the same God who worked in the lives of the ancients also work in our present day?" Her eyes narrowed and her lips pursed as she folded her arms and shook her head. "You are being impossible. We do not know enough about each other to tie ourselves together for life." There was a slight curve to the side of her mouth that gave him to know that she was not as set against him as she might try to appear to be. "I am not proposing we marry this instant. I only wish to know if you would allow me to call on you with the intention that one day, when you have discovered that I am right and that we are well suited to one another, we will marry." "When I discover that you are right," she said with a laugh, "you, sir, are very determined." "Never more so," he replied with a grin. Indeed, he had never in all of his life felt as certain about anything as he did about the fact that he knew he was having just one of the many arguments he would have with his future wife. Wife. It was a word that normally made him quake. But not now, not here, not with her. He scooted around her and snatched up her bonnet from where it still lay beside the leg of her chair. "My hat!" she cried. "And a very pretty one it is." "You're not seriously planning to hold my hat ransom until I agree to consider becoming your wife, are you?" Darcy shrugged and turned her bonnet in his hand before hiding it behind his back. "It worked to keep you from venturing out into the storm, and if it worked once—" He shrugged again. She shook her head. "I cannot deny that I would very much like to learn more about you, nor can I say that your proposal does not intrigue me. However, you must know that I will not be easily persuaded." "Then you will accept my offer of a possible future marriage?" She nodded. "Now, may I have my bonnet?" He shook his head even as he drew the bonnet out from behind his back and stepped towards her. "Not until we have sealed our agreement with a kiss," he said as he placed her bonnet on her head, before tipping her chin and looking down into her eyes. "May I?" "But we are not betrothed." "Oh, but we are." "You are an impossible man." "Indeed. But may I kiss you?" She drew a breath and released it as her eyes lowered for a moment before returning to his. "You may, but—" He did not wait for her conditions, but bent and claimed her lips, as he wrapped his arms around her and pulled her close. Relishing in the softness of her form, his body groaned, warning him of the storm he would have to face in controlling his desires, and thunder rumbled in the distance as if it was taking its leave, having completed its work in bringing these two together. This has been Thunder, a Nature's Fury and Delights novelette, written by Leenie Brown, narrated by Christopher, an authorized voice replica. The 2018 copyright for Thunder is held by Leenie Brown, all rights reserved.